you all today about the role of the private sector in humanitarian aid, but it turns out this is going to actually be more about the role of the private sector, not just in humanitarian aid, but in development initiatives in general. So we're going to start with the understanding that the private sector is playing an increasingly influential role in humanitarian aid by providing financial management and technological expertise. They're also providing direct financial support through philanthropic or corporate responsibility initiatives. And there's also an understanding that the private sector tends to be a little bit more efficient than bureaucratic aid or development organizations. So this picture here is a tent city that's popped up in Kathmandu, Nepal. There was a 7.9 magnitude earthquake over the weekend. And so the hypothesis of my project is twofold. First of all, it's that if we build aid systems that incorporate private sector expertise into the pre-planning stages, we'll end up with more efficient, sustainable, and impactful aid responses. The second part of the hypothesis is that private sector companies are incentivized to participate in humanitarian aid for the potential benefits related to financial, commercial, and social returns on investment. And my research actually confirmed this second part of the hypothesis. I found that businesses are participating for potential financial returns, and if it's not actually financial returns, it might be commercial returns that might provide longer-term financial benefits, such as enhancing a company's external reputation, uniting employees around a common cause, or attracting and retaining talent. As far as social returns on investment, these are typically things that NGOs or donor organizations or even governments are more interested in measuring, but we're finding that private sector companies are also starting to measure social returns on investment. And these would be things that improve livelihood, so whether it's improved health, higher employment rates, higher earnings, those would be social returns on investment. So to address the hypothesis, I conducted a literature review. I also met with professionals from the World Bank, from DAI, a consulting firm, from Berkeley Center for Responsible Business, a professional from IKEA who works in sustainability, and also someone from the National Peace Corps Association. And then I conducted an in-depth case study with Visa, which is the world's largest payments network. And so what I found was really that it's not just about the role of the private sector in humanitarian aid, but also the role of the private sector in development and the link between aid and development. This actually parallels my own professional experience because most of you know I have a background in disaster response with the International Committee of the Red Cross and also with the American Red Cross. And so why did I, someone with a background in humanitarian assistance, choose a program that's focused on development when I could have gone to programs focused on humanitarian assistance? And I think the reason is something that I knew then is something that businesses are learning now, and that's that addressing these underlying development issues related to poverty and public health and climate change actually mitigates the risks of the impacts of shocks on affected populations. So I'm going to follow George's lead and give my own personal definition of development. If you're an MVP student, you've been charged with creating your own definition. And so my definition of development is that development is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the state of and mechanisms for the maximization of human well-being. So that's a mouthful. If we think about the Millennium Development Goals, development addresses issues around poverty, education, public health, and environmental sustainability. And meanwhile, humanitarian aid is actually aid that seeks to alleviate the suffering and save lives of communities affected by crises. And these crises can be sudden onset, so it could be the earthquake in Nepal, it could be wildfires, it could be typhoons, or they can be slow onset, so related to temperature changes, sea level rise, land and forest degradation, so whether that's drought or famine. And so again, how does humanitarian aid relate to development? And so we know that disasters and aid crises have a more significant effect on the most vulnerable portions of the population, driving more people into poverty and creating poverty traps where people can't escape poverty. So one of the main findings of my research was that addressing these development issues will actually improve the humanitarian aid outcomes. And so we know that in 2012, USAID recognized the link between humanitarian aid and development by actually integrating its own humanitarian aid and development initiatives. So thinking back to my hypothesis, what I found was there's actually a strong business case for private sector participation in long-term aid and development initiatives over just responding to short-term crises, because it's less ad hoc, it's less reactionary, it provides a more reliable return on investment for businesses rather than waiting for the next crises to occur. And also businesses will be better positioned to provide support during the crises if they're integrated into the overall development activities of a country. So the types of businesses that might participate in both development and aid initiatives would be construction contractors, transportation providers, procurement and logistics companies, payment networks. And so let's imagine for a minute this construction contractor that's removing rubble in Nepal. Imagine if they had pre-arranged agreements with local governments, international NGOs, aid donors. Imagine if the logistics were prearranged, if they had pricing agreements already set up, if the equipment was pre-staged. This would result in coordination that's more efficient and saves time. It would be more sustainable because businesses will be likely to support aid efforts if they're also making returns on investment, whether financial, commercial, or social, related to longer-term development initiatives. And it will be more impactful in terms of saving lives and easing suffering related with the faster response. So one of the main findings of this project was that in order to improve the efficiency, sustainability, and impact of humanitarian aid efforts, private sector companies should not only pre-plan their initiatives, but they should also link their humanitarian aid initiatives with longer-term development initiatives. And they should also help to build integrated solutions with international NGOs, with local and national governments, with other private sector organizations and donor organizations, as well as with the beneficiaries themselves. And so these findings have implications not just for the private sector, but also for all sectors involved in disaster response, humanitarian aid, and development in general. Thank you.
Did you do any sort of specific case study on a region, and how would this, are you seeing this being standardized throughout the world, or do you think that this has to be very specific based on certain areas?
Right, so I did a specific case study of Visa, the payments network, but it does depend. Regions definitely affect the types of responses, and regions play a part in where companies are going to first create solutions that integrate humanitarian aid and development. Obviously, there are regions that are more affected by Category 2 crises than others. Those might be places to start. But it was more of a particular business case study rather than a regional.
I find the logistics of this a little bit confusing. That's an expensive piece of equipment there. If I am a construction company and I own that equipment, or I'm a leasing company and I own that equipment, I lease it out, I can't afford to have it just sitting around waiting. I mean, supposedly we've known for 20 years that an earthquake was going to hit Nepal. So, but then if I have it busy somewhere, I can't afford to let that paying client down either. In addition, it has to be airlifted. So I'm finding the logistics of this pre-positioning. And food spoils. Some food doesn't spoil, but food spoils. I see it a little bit easier with things like bandages and medical supplies and maybe regional. Can you explain a little bit more about how that works? Who's going to pay the bill for the storage costs?
So I think you're more of the expert on this than I am, but obviously it depends on the business and the incentives. So if it's a contractor, obviously there might be a little bit more difficult logistics than another organization such as payments companies. In terms of food storage, we know that aid organizations are moving away from providing in-kind donations and are really moving towards providing direct cash or electronic cash. And so that might save some of the issues around food. Again, related to that, there's going to need to be Okay. Related to that, there's going to need to be pre-planned sort of mitigation activities to deal with issues around electricity. If you're providing electronic cash, people need to have a place to withdraw it and to use it. So again, the big picture here is that if you link that, if companies are just sitting around waiting for crises to happen, as you said, they're going to be wasting money, and that they can really, instead of just companies moving towards, getting into the disaster response game, they should be really looking at the overall development situation in general, and they can find returns that way. Rob?
Do you foresee any risks by doing this? What do you think would be some potential downsides to these types of partnerships?
So definitely there are risks when you have multiple actors responding to humanitarian aid, crises, or development projects in general, especially if they're coming in with no expertise and a lot of money and some sort of, passion behind them that's not really well driven, that's not either connected to the local community or in, with the community's best interest at hand. And they're more focused on their own financial returns and less on actual saving lives, then there's definitely huge risks. There's been a lot of movement over the last 2 decades to link humanitarian aid actors with the private sector. The UN OCHA has linked up with the World Economic Forum, and they're providing ways for private sector actors to work with humanitarian aid. So I definitely think that involving private sector actors in the expertise of the aid communities and the development communities is the first step to providing solid responses.
Okay. That's our